During the winter and early spring of 1944 to 1945, American ground forces operating in Western Europe conducted sustained operations against German fortified positions constructed before and during the war. These positions included permanent concrete works, reinforced gun casemates, underground shelters, observation bunkers, and interconnected trench systems. Many of these fortifications were located along river lines, transportation hubs, and border regions, and had been occupied by German units tasked with delaying advancing Allied formations. Reports from American field headquarters recorded repeated encounters with reinforced structures that resisted standard field artillery, tank fire, and infantry-delivered explosives. In response to these conditions, the United States Army deployed heavy artillery assets assigned specifically for the reduction of fortified targets. Among these weapons were 240 mm howitzers, designated M1, operated by separate heavy artillery battalions. These weapons had been developed prior to the war and transported to the European theater in limited numbers due to their size, weight, and logistical requirements. Each howitzer required extensive preparation before firing, including reinforced gun platforms, surveyed firing data, and coordinated ammunition supply. Their presence was noted in operational orders as part of deliberate assaults rather than mobile engagements. By late 1944, several 240 mm howitzer battalions had been assigned to armies operating in the European theater. Movement orders placed these units behind advancing corps sectors where German fortifications had been identified by aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, and prisoner interrogations. Engineers prepared firing positions using timber, steel matting, and excavated earth to absorb recoil forces. Each emplacement process involved cranes, tractors, and crews working over multiple days under camouflage discipline. Once established, the guns remained static for the duration of assigned fire missions. German fortified positions encountered during this period included structures built under the Westwall program and independent strongpoints constructed during later phases of the war. These installations varied in design, thickness, and depth. Many consisted of reinforced concrete walls exceeding 2 meters in thickness, with steel-reinforced firing embrasures, overhead cover, and internal compartments designed to resist bombardment. Some were connected by tunnels and protected by minefields and wire obstacles. German garrison units occupying these positions included fortress infantry, artillery detachments, and support personnel. American intelligence summaries from Corps and Army levels noted that conventional artillery calibers, including 105 mm and 155 mm guns, produced limited structural damage against the heaviest fortifications. Observations from forward observers and aerial photography recorded cratering and surface damage without collapse of internal chambers. As a result, fire plans increasingly incorporated heavy artillery to achieve penetration effects. The 240 mm howitzer fired a projectile weighing approximately 360 pounds, with a high explosive charge designed for deep penetration and structural destruction. Ammunition handling required cranes and specialized transport vehicles. Each round was assembled near the gun position, fused according to mission requirements, and loaded manually with mechanical assistance. Firing rates were low, often limited to 1 round every several minutes, to preserve barrel integrity and maintain accuracy. Fire missions were coordinated through artillery headquarters using surveyed target coordinates. Observers relayed adjustments based on observed impact. Due to the distance between firing positions and targets, ranging shots were required. The first impacts were often observed through binoculars, spotting scopes, or aircraft reports. Corrections were applied incrementally until rounds impacted designated aim points on bunker roofs, embrasures, or structural junctions. German units occupying the targeted fortifications recorded the effects of heavy artillery in situation reports and after-action messages transmitted to higher headquarters when communications remained intact. These reports described the penetration of overhead cover, collapse of internal walls, and damage to ventilation systems. In some instances, entire sections of fortifications were rendered unusable due to structural failure following repeated impacts. During operations along the Ruhr River and later during crossings of the Rhine, American heavy artillery units were tasked with neutralizing German positions guarding bridge approaches and riverbanks. Preparatory fires included scheduled concentrations from 240 mm howitzers aimed at known bunker complexes. Engineers marked targets based on reconnaissance data. Fire missions were executed during daylight and nighttime hours, depending on tactical requirements. In several documented engagements, the first successful penetrations by 240 mm rounds resulted in visible collapse of concrete roofs and expulsion of debris from firing apertures. Dust clouds and shock effects were observed extending beyond the immediate impact area. Follow-on rounds were directed at adjacent structures to exploit breaches. Infantry units advancing afterward reported reduced resistance within the targeted zones, encountering damaged installations with blocked entrances or collapsed interiors. German personnel within these fortifications attempted repairs when possible, using timber supports and debris removal. However, continued bombardment limited such efforts. Communications cables were frequently severed, isolating individual bunkers. Reports captured after engagements noted difficulties in maintaining command and control under heavy artillery fire. In some cases, garrison units withdrew through rear exits or underground passages when available. American artillery logs recorded ammunition expenditures, barrel wear, and maintenance requirements following sustained firing. Crew rotations were implemented due to physical demands of ammunition handling. Weather conditions, including rain and freezing temperatures, affected ground stability at gun positions, requiring ongoing engineering support. Despite these challenges, scheduled fire missions were maintained as ordered. The use of 240 mm howitzers was often synchronized with air attacks and medium artillery barrages. Air reconnaissance provided damage assessments between fire missions. Photographs taken after bombardments showed cratered bunker roofs, fractured concrete, and displaced armored shutters. These images were circulated among headquarters to update operational planning. German counter-battery fire against heavy artillery positions was limited due to range and ammunition constraints. Some attempts were recorded, involving long-range guns firing blind or based on sound ranging. American units employed camouflage nets, dispersion, and relocation when feasible. No rapid displacement was possible once a 240 mm gun was emplaced, and protection relied on concealment and defensive perimeter security. As American forces advanced into German territory, similar employment of heavy howitzers continued against urban fortifications and hardened shelters. Cities with pre-war defensive works or reinforced administrative buildings were subjected to planned reductions. Targets included flak towers, reinforced cellars, and command bunkers. Fire missions were approved at high command levels due to ammunition scarcity and logistical considerations. Captured German documents referenced the presence of unusually large artillery impacts and described the difficulty of maintaining fortified positions under such fire. Engineering assessments conducted by German units acknowledged that certain structures were not designed to withstand repeated impacts from projectiles of that size. These assessments were transmitted as technical observations without recommendations that could be implemented during ongoing operations. American infantry reports following assaults on bombarded positions detailed encounters with damaged fortifications showing internal collapse, destroyed equipment, and disrupted defensive layouts. These reports focused on tactical conditions encountered during clearing operations. Medical units documented casualties resulting from blast effects within enclosed spaces, including concussive injuries and structural collapses. Throughout these operations, the employment of 240 mm howitzers remained limited to specific objectives. Their logistical footprint required rail transport to forward depots, heavy tractors for movement, and engineer support for emplacement. Planning documents emphasized careful target selection to conserve ammunition and minimize unnecessary firing. By early 1945, as American units crossed major rivers and advanced into central Germany, remaining fortified positions were engaged as encountered. Heavy artillery battalions continued to receive fire missions against identified strongpoints. Coordination between artillery, engineers, and infantry remained procedural and documented through standard reporting channels. Operational records from this period consist of firing tables, mission logs, damage assessments, and unit diaries. These documents record times, locations, ammunition types, and observed effects without commentary beyond immediate tactical observations. The actions described occurred within the constraints of weather, terrain, and enemy dispositions as recorded at the time. The sequence of events involving the deployment and firing of American 240mm howitzers against German fortifications unfolded as part of ongoing ground operations. Each engagement was recorded through the administrative and operational systems in place, producing a detailed account of procedures, movements, and effects as they were observed and reported during the conduct of the war. By January 1945, American armies operating east of the Meuse and west of the Rhine encountered fortified zones that had been reinforced during the preceding months. German command directives issued during the autumn of 1944 had ordered the occupation and repair of existing permanent defenses and the construction of additional hardened positions where time and materials allowed. These efforts focused on river crossings, road junctions, urban perimeters, and terrain features offering observation and fields of fire. As American formations advanced, these defenses were encountered in varying states of completion and manning. Heavy artillery units equipped with 240mm howitzers continued to be assigned to missions involving these fortified areas. Orders for their employment were issued through Army Artillery Headquarters and coordinated with corps-level operations. The movement of these units required advance reconnaissance of routes capable of supporting heavy loads. Road surfaces, bridges, and rail spurs were inspected and, where necessary, reinforced by engineer units. In some sectors, rail transport delivered gun components to forward depots, from which tractors hauled them to prepared positions. The emplacement of a 240mm howitzer followed established procedures. Engineers cleared and leveled the site, excavated recoil pits, and constructed timber and steel platforms. Anchoring systems were installed to absorb recoil forces. Survey teams established precise orientation and elevation data. Camouflage measures were applied to reduce aerial detection, including netting and natural vegetation. Ammunition storage points were established nearby, protected from weather and observation. German defensive planning in these sectors relied on layered fortifications. Forward positions often consisted of fieldworks, while rear positions included reinforced concrete structures. Many bunkers were designed with overlapping fields of fire and mutual support. Some incorporated armored cupolas or retractable turrets. Ventilation systems, power supplies, and communications were routed through protected conduits. These installations were intended to remain operational under sustained bombardment from field artillery. American intelligence units compiled target lists based on aerial photography, captured maps, and reports from reconnaissance patrols. Identified fortifications were categorized by type, construction, and estimated resistance. Heavy howitzers were allocated to targets assessed as resistant to lighter calibers. Fire plans specified sequence, number of rounds, and fusing options, including delayed action fuses intended to penetrate before detonation. During preparatory bombardments preceding ground assaults, 240mm howitzers fired according to scheduled times. Observation posts monitored impacts where visibility permitted. In wooded or urban areas, aerial observers provided feedback. Impacts were noted for penetration depth, structural damage, and secondary effects such as debris expulsion. Adjustments were communicated through artillery command channels. German units subjected to this fire attempted to maintain defensive posture. Situation reports transmitted by surviving communications described conditions within fortifications, including structural damage, loss of power, and blocked firing apertures. In some instances, reports indicated that overhead cover had been breached, causing collapse of internal rooms. Medical reports referenced casualties resulting from falling debris and blast effects within enclosed spaces. Attempts at countermeasures included reinforcement of damaged sections with timber and sandbags. Some garrisons attempted to redistribute personnel within tunnel networks to avoid direct impacts. However, repeated heavy artillery fire limited movement and repair efforts. Ammunition shortages and disrupted supply lines further constrained defensive actions. American artillery battalions recorded each firing mission in detail. Logs included time of fire, number of rounds expended, charge used, and observed effects. Maintenance sections monitored barrel wear and recoil system performance. Crews rotated duties to manage fatigue, particularly during prolonged firing periods in cold conditions. Heating equipment was used where possible to prevent mechanical issues caused by freezing temperatures. Weather during this period affected operations. Rain and thawing ground complicated emplacement stability and ammunition transport. Snow and fog limited observation, requiring reliance on pre-surveyed data and map coordinates. Despite these conditions, scheduled fire missions proceeded as ordered. Delays were documented and communicated to supported units. As American infantry advanced following bombardments, they encountered fortified positions that had been subjected to heavy fire. After-action reports described entrances blocked by debris, collapsed roofs, and disabled weapons within bunkers. In some cases, fortifications remained structurally intact but were abandoned. Clearing operations proceeded according to infantry doctrine, with engineers assisting in the removal of obstacles and demolition of remaining structures when required. German withdrawal from some fortified zones occurred under pressure from advancing units and continued artillery fire. Orders captured later indicated that some positions were to be held as long as possible, while others were designated for delay actions only. Communications breakdowns often resulted in individual garrisons acting independently once isolated. In urban areas, heavy howitzers were employed against reinforced buildings used as defensive strongpoints. Targets included concrete basements, flak emplacements, and command shelters integrated into civilian structures. Fire missions were planned to avoid friendly troop movement zones and coordinated closely with ground commanders. Damage assessments relied on aerial imagery and ground reports. The logistical demands of 240 mm howitzer operations remained significant. Ammunition resupply required coordination with Army service units. Each projectile was transported separately, and stock levels were monitored closely. Fire missions were prioritized based on operational needs, with some targets receiving limited numbers of rounds due to supply constraints. German engineering assessments recovered after engagements noted the effects of large-caliber artillery on concrete structures. These documents described cracking, spalling, and penetration patterns observed following impacts. They also referenced the limitations of existing designs when subjected to repeated heavy hits. Such assessments were recorded without reference to broader operational implications. Throughout February 1945, as American forces closed on the Rhine, remaining fortified positions along approach routes were systematically engaged. Heavy artillery continued to be assigned to these tasks. Coordination between artillery, engineers, and infantry followed established procedures, documented through orders and reports issued at the time. Operational records from this phase include daily journals, firing charts, and intelligence summaries. These documents record actions as they occurred, including movements, engagements, and observed effects. The use of 240 mm howitzers against German fortifications formed part of these recorded operations, executed according to directives and conditions present during the ongoing campaign. By March 1945, American forces had established bridgeheads east of the Rhine in several sectors. German defensive efforts in these areas relied on remaining fortified installations, many of which had been constructed before the war or expanded during earlier phases of the conflict. These included reinforced concrete bunkers, underground command posts, flak towers adapted for ground defense, and hardened shelters integrated into industrial and transportation infrastructure. Despite losses incurred during previous engagements, German units continued to occupy these positions where orders and conditions allowed. Heavy artillery battalions equipped with 240 mm howitzers were redeployed as the front shifted eastward. Movement orders were issued with attention to damaged infrastructure resulting from combat and aerial bombardment. Engineers conducted route clearance and bridge reinforcement to permit passage of heavy equipment. In some instances, temporary bridges were constructed or existing structures were strengthened to accommodate the weight of gun components and prime movers. Upon arrival in new operational areas, reconnaissance teams selected firing positions based on range to targets, ground stability, and concealment. Emplacement procedures remained consistent, involving excavation, platform construction, anchoring, and survey alignment. These preparations were documented in unit logs, noting time required, personnel involved, and materials consumed. Once emplaced, the howitzers were integrated into army-level fire plans. German fortifications encountered during this phase varied widely in condition. Some had been damaged by previous artillery or air attacks but remained partially functional. Others were newly occupied or repaired using available materials. Many installations showed evidence of hasty reinforcement, including additional earth cover, timber bracing, and improvised blast protection. Ventilation and power systems were often degraded due to earlier damage. American intelligence continued to compile target data through aerial reconnaissance, ground patrols, and analysis of captured documents. Fortified positions were plotted on maps and assigned priority levels. Heavy howitzers were allocated to targets assessed as requiring penetration beyond the capability of medium artillery. Fire orders specified aiming points intended to compromise structural integrity, such as roof sections, junctions of walls, or entrances. Fire missions were executed under varying conditions. In some sectors, clear weather allowed direct observation of impacts. In others, smoke, dust, or urban terrain limited visibility. Adjustments were made using sound ranging, flash spotting, and aerial observation when available. Reports noted instances where delayed action fuses allowed projectiles to penetrate concrete before detonation, resulting in internal collapse. German reports from units subjected to these bombardments described the immediate effects within fortifications. Communications recorded loss of lighting, blocked exits, and damage to weapons mounts. Some reports indicated that shock effects rendered equipment inoperable or dislodged stored ammunition. Medical entries referenced injuries caused by falling concrete fragments and blast pressure. Attempts to maintain defensive capability included relocation of personnel to deeper sections of bunkers or adjacent tunnels. In some cases, garrisons attempted to clear debris and restore firing positions between bombardments. These efforts were frequently interrupted by continued artillery fire. Supply difficulties, including shortages of repair materials and medical supplies, were noted in German communications. American artillery units maintained detailed records of operations. Firing logs documented each round expended, including charge, fuse setting, and target designation. Maintenance records tracked wear on barrels and recoil systems. Instances of mechanical issues were reported and addressed by ordnance personnel. Crew rotations and rest schedules were adjusted to sustain operations over extended periods. Weather conditions during March affected both sides. Rain and thawing ground complicated movement and emplacement. Flooded areas limited access to some targets and firing positions. Fog and low clouds restricted aerial observation. Despite these factors, fire missions continued according to operational requirements, with adjustments noted in daily journals. As American infantry advanced into fortified zones following bombardments, they encountered a range of conditions. After-action reports described fortifications with collapsed roofs, blocked entrances, and damaged internal compartments. In some cases, defenders had withdrawn prior to infantry arrival. In others, resistance continued from partially intact positions. Clearing operations proceeded with engineer support to remove obstacles and demolish remaining structures when ordered. Urban combat presented additional challenges. Fortified buildings were often integrated into dense civilian structures. Heavy howitzers were employed selectively against such targets to avoid interference with friendly operations. Fire missions were planned with precise coordination, and damage assessments relied on aerial photography and ground reconnaissance. Reports documented the effects on reinforced basements, stairwells, and internal load-bearing walls. German command directives during this period emphasized delaying actions and defense of key transportation routes. Fortified positions guarding road junctions, bridges, and rail lines were ordered held where possible. However, communications disruptions and rapid American advances resulted in fragmented defensive efforts. Some garrisons operated without direct contact with higher headquarters. Captured German engineering documents provided technical descriptions of damage observed in fortifications struck by heavy artillery. These documents included sketches and measurements of cracks, penetrations, and collapsed sections. Observations focused on structural behavior under impact and blast conditions. The documents did not include analysis beyond immediate technical description. American service units continued to manage the logistical demands of heavy artillery. Ammunition supply chains extended from ports and depots through railheads to forward positions. Transportation units coordinated delivery schedules to match planned fire missions. Shortages or delays were recorded and communicated through supply channels. By late March, American forces advanced deeper into central Germany. Remaining fortified positions were engaged as encountered, often under time constraints dictated by operational tempo. Heavy artillery battalions adjusted to new assignments, sometimes displacing guns to maintain range to targets. Each displacement required repetition of emplacement procedures and coordination with supported units. Operational records from this phase include daily situation reports, artillery journals, engineer logs, and intelligence summaries. These documents record actions as they occurred, including movements, bombardments, and observed effects on German fortifications. The employment of 240 mm howitzers during this period was documented as part of ongoing ground operations, conducted according to orders and conditions present at the time. In early April 1945, American Field Headquarters issued movement and fire support directives aligned with continued advance across central Germany. In multiple sectors, German units attempted to organize defense around remaining hardened positions and built up areas where reinforced structures, railway embankments, canal lines, and industrial compounds offered cover and protected firing locations. Reports from American Corps described organized resistance from isolated strongpoints supported by concrete shelters, reinforced basements, and pre-war or wartime bunker construction. In several instances, these positions were tied to existing air defense works adapted for ground combat, including heavy flak emplacements protected by concrete and earth. Separate heavy artillery battalions with 240 mm howitzers received orders to displace forward as ranges changed and target lists expanded. March firing positions, located to cover Rhine bridgeheads and nearby fortified areas, were no longer within effective range of targets deeper inland. Displacement orders specified new railheads, road routes, and engineer support requirements. Movement was executed in stages, with advance parties reconnoitering routes for load capacity and congestion. Road conditions reflected recent combat movement and damage, including cratered surfaces, broken culverts, and traffic control points established by military police. Engineer units performed repairs and route clearance to maintain continuity of supply and heavy equipment movement. Upon arrival in new areas, 240 mm units established firing positions selected for ground stability, concealment, and secure perimeter. Emplacement work proceeded under standard technical procedures. Sites were leveled and, where necessary, drained. Recoil pits were dug and reinforced. Timber and steel were assembled into gun platforms. Anchors and spades were set to absorb recoil forces. Survey sections established line and elevation, confirming orientation relative to the target grid. Communications lines were laid to battery command posts and to supporting fire direction centers. Camouflage measures were applied, including netting and the use of local materials to reduce aerial and ground observation. Ammunition supply points were established with overhead cover where possible, with separation distances observed to limit loss from counterfire or accidental detonation. Target selection for 240 mm howitzers was conducted through Army and Corps artillery channels. Intelligence sections compiled lists from aerial photographs, forward patrol reports, captured maps, and interrogation summaries. Targets designated for heavy-caliber fire included reinforced command shelters, bunker clusters covering road approaches, and hardened structures within industrial facilities used as defensive nodes. Where German positions were embedded within towns, targets were defined by grid coordinates and structural descriptions, such as reinforced basements, concrete utility buildings, and fortified rail installations. Fire orders specified projectile type, fuse setting, propellant charge, and planned number of rounds. For reinforced concrete and earth-covered targets, delayed action fuses were frequently ordered, with the intent of achieving penetration before detonation. Fire plans often assigned heavy artillery to a limited set of objectives due to ammunition constraints and the time required for emplacement and firing. When a 240 mm battery was assigned a mission, supporting units adjusted their own fire schedules to avoid interference and to coordinate infantry movement with the bombardment timeline. Observation during April operations varied by terrain and weather. In open terrain, forward observers and observation posts provided direct correction by watching impact points. In built-up zones, direct observation was limited by smoke, dust, and urban masking, and adjustment relied on surveyed data, shell reporting, and aerial observation when aircraft were available. When aircraft were used, pilot reports and photographic runs were routed through air-ground liaison and relayed to artillery headquarters. Corrections were issued as adjustments in deflection and range, with subsequent rounds fired in measured sequence. Each mission was recorded in firing logs, including time on target, rounds fired, and reported effects. German communications during this period were intermittent in many areas, but where signal lines remained intact, situation reports and messages described bombardment effects in technical and immediate terms. Reports captured during subsequent advances included entries noting heavy-caliber impacts on concrete cover, collapse of interior partitions, and blockage of entrances. Some reports described the disruption of ventilation and power, resulting in reduced habitability within shelters. In a number of messages, German units reported that personnel were unable to occupy upper firing levels following repeated impacts due to debris and blast pressure. Where exact quotations were preserved in translated intelligence summaries, those summaries noted terms indicating that personnel were shaken or disoriented after direct hits and near misses, and that immediate reoccupation of firing apertures was delayed by falling fragments and dust. In sectors where German positions were organized around canal lines and river tributaries, reinforced concrete shelters were integrated with embankments and lock installations. These positions were engaged by combined arms. Medium artillery and tanks engaged visible apertures and fieldworks, while heavy artillery was tasked against identified reinforced points. Engineer reconnaissance identified likely bunker locations at lockhouses, bridge abutments, and rail crossings. When 240 mm fire was ordered, aim points were assigned to structural junctions, overhead cover, and entrances. Initial rounds were used for registration if prior survey data was incomplete. Subsequent rounds were fired according to adjusted data. Observation reports noted impacts producing large craters, collapse of earth cover, and visible structural cracking. Where direct penetration occurred, reports described expulsion of debris from openings and a reduction in observed fire from the targeted position. American infantry units advancing behind preparatory fires reported encountering a mixture of conditions. Some bunkers showed roof collapse, entrances blocked by concrete fragments, and internal rooms partially filled with debris. In other cases, fortifications remained externally intact but exhibited interior damage, including displaced doors, broken mounts, and damaged communications equipment. Clearing procedures followed standard practice. Assault teams approached under cover, checked for mines and booby traps, and used explosive charges, flame weapons were authorized and available, and demolition to neutralize remaining resistance. Engineers assisted with obstacle removal, lane marking through minefields, and reduction of wire and anti-tank obstacles. Reports described cases where defenders withdrew through rear exits during bombardment, leaving positions empty or partially occupied when infantry arrived. In industrial areas, German defense often utilized reinforced utility structures, factory basements, and concrete-lined tunnels. Some facilities included air raid shelters built with thick walls and overhead cover, designed for civilian protection but used as troop shelters and firing points. In such cases, target descriptions in American fire requests included building types, wall thickness estimates, and visible apertures. When 240 mm howitzers were assigned to these targets, fire direction centers incorporated safety limits to avoid friendly casualties, using restricted zones and coordinated timing. After bombardment, infantry reports noted that some reinforced buildings had suffered partial collapse, with floors dropped into lower levels and stairwells blocked. In other cases, roofs were cratered and interior supports damaged without full collapse. Damage assessments were recorded through ground inspection when feasible and supplemented by aerial photographs when available. Heavy artillery battalion diaries during this phase recorded continuous maintenance and supply management. Recoil mechanisms required inspection after each firing period. Barrels were checked for wear and erosion. Lubricants and hydraulic fluids were monitored, particularly under variable temperatures. Ammunition handling remained labor-intensive. Projectiles were moved from supply points to the gun using mechanical aids and crew labor. Fuses were installed under supervision, and propellant charges were prepared and verified. Safety procedures were observed for handling and storage. Misfires and hangfires, when they occurred, were managed according to drill, with waiting periods enforced and breach operations conducted under prescribed conditions. Any incidents were recorded and reported to ordnance channels. German counter-battery actions against heavy artillery positions were limited in many areas due to disorganization, fuel shortages, and the displacement of German artillery. Where counter-fire occurred, it was recorded as sporadic long-range fire, mortar harassing fire, or localized artillery concentrations. Heavy artillery positions relied on concealment, dispersion of support vehicles, and perimeter defense. Security details coordinated with nearby infantry units to prevent infiltration. Air threat in April was addressed through available anti-aircraft coverage and camouflage discipline. Night movement of ammunition and supplies was used where traffic and observation conditions required it. As encirclement operations progressed in certain regions, American Corps reported German concentrations within pockets where defense relied on towns, roadblocks, and improvised strongpoints reinforced by remaining bunker installations. Heavy artillery was sometimes assigned to reduce specific fortified nodes controlling roads needed for continued movement. Fire plans in these situations were constrained by the pace of operations. Some targets were bypassed when feasible, while others were engaged to open routes for armor and supply columns. When 240 mm howitzers were used, mission requests emphasized precision and limited round counts. Reports following these missions noted that heavy impacts could block roads with rubble and cratered surfaces, requiring engineers to clear routes after the objective was taken. In some cases, German units attempted to hold positions within pre-existing military compounds, training grounds, or fortified depots. These compounds included reinforced buildings and shelters constructed to withstand air attack. American intelligence summaries identified such locations through map references and reconnaissance. When heavy artillery was assigned, the mission was often coordinated with other fires to suppress surrounding positions. After bombardment, assault units reported damaged structures and disrupted internal routes. Captured personnel provided statements during interrogation about the effects of heavy shelling inside enclosed shelters, describing reduced visibility from dust, difficulty moving through blocked corridors, and injuries from falling fragments. These statements were recorded in interrogation summaries with time and place references, and relayed through intelligence channels. During continued advances, heavy artillery units occasionally found themselves operating near rapidly shifting front lines. This required frequent updates to safety limits, friendly line locations, and restricted fire areas. Fire direction centers maintained liaison with supported divisions and corps artillery. Coordinates for targets were checked against current maps and reports. In some sectors, civilians moved through areas near target zones, and civil affairs channels coordinated with units to manage traffic and prevent entry into active fire areas when possible. These conditions were recorded in unit journals as part of operational constraints. As April progressed, German fortified resistance increasingly appeared as isolated points rather than continuous lines in many areas. American reports described scattered bunker positions, reinforced roadblocks, and strongpoints tied to local terrain. Heavy artillery continued to be employed selectively against those points identified as requiring penetration. The 240 mm howitzers, once emplaced, were assigned missions over periods measured in days rather than hours, with multiple targets engaged in sequence. Each mission produced entries in artillery journals documenting target designation, number of rounds fired, fuse settings, and observer comments on effects. German administrative and technical records captured in the course of advances included engineering notes on damage sustained by concrete structures under heavy bombardment. These notes described spalling of interior surfaces, cracking patterns radiating from impact points, and failure of supporting beams in reinforced shelters. In several instances, notes referenced that certain overhead thicknesses were insufficient under repeated heavy hits and that repairs could not be completed under continued fire. Where such notes were transmitted as field messages, they included immediate requests for materials or for permission to relocate personnel to alternative shelters. Communications disruption frequently prevented delivery or response, and some messages were found unsent or partially completed in abandoned positions. American damage assessment teams and intelligence personnel recorded observations of struck fortifications when access permitted. Photographs and sketches were made of impact craters, penetrations, and collapsed sections. Measurements were taken in some cases to estimate concrete thickness and depth of penetration. These observations were compiled for technical and operational use, with distribution through artillery and engineer channels. The recorded details focused on physical effects and immediate operational considerations, including whether a position remained capable of defense, whether entrances were passable, and whether collapse made the structure unusable. In late April 1945, as operations continued into additional regions, heavy artillery battalions received further displacement and mission orders based on evolving target requirements. Some batteries remained in place to support ongoing reduction of stubborn fortified points while other elements prepared to move. The administrative record continued to reflect the pattern of emplacement, fire execution, observation, and assessment, with each entry tied to current orders and conditions. The employment of 240 mm howitzers against German fortified structures during this phase remained governed by the availability of targets requiring heavy penetration, the logistical ability to sustain ammunition supply, and the coordination demands of advancing ground operations conducted under active wartime conditions. In late April and early May 1945, American field commands issued continuing operational instructions for advance, encirclement, and occupation tasks in areas where organized German resistance persisted. Reports from corps and divisions recorded that resistance appeared in varying forms, including roadblocks, strongpoints in built-up areas, and isolated fortified installations occupied by mixed personnel from regular army units, training establishments, fortress troops, and ad hoc formations assembled from available manpower. Some positions were located within pre-war military facilities, air defense sites, and reinforced depots. Others were located along transportation corridors where concrete shelters and hardened structures had been constructed for protection against air attack and adapted for ground defense. Separate heavy artillery battalions equipped with 240 mm howitzers remained in operation where target requirements justified their continued use. Army artillery staffs reviewed target lists daily and issued fire missions against hardened points that delayed movement or presented protected firing positions capable of covering key routes. Where the pace of advance reduced time available for deliberate reduction, heavy artillery missions were limited to those targets assessed as requiring immediate neutralization by penetration and structural collapse rather than suppression alone. Movement of 240 mm units during this period continued under strict logistical constraints. Road and rail networks remained congested with troop columns, supply convoys, and displaced civilians. Engineer units repaired bridges and cleared debris to maintain heavy transport routes. In some locations, rubble from previous combat and aerial bombardment restricted movement to single lanes, requiring traffic control and scheduled passage for heavy equipment. Unit journals recorded delays caused by damaged bridges, soft ground, and detours imposed by traffic regulation. Advance parties coordinated with local command posts to secure firing areas and establish perimeter defense prior to emplacement. Emplacement procedures remained standardized. Firing positions were selected for stability and range, then prepared by engineers and gun crews. Recoil pits and platforms were constructed. Survey sections laid out azimuth and elevation based on the current artillery grid. Communications lines were established to connect the battery command post, fire direction center, and liaison elements with supported units. Camouflage was maintained as a routine measure. Ammunition supply points were positioned to support the planned number of rounds, with stock monitored against allocation. Targets assigned in late April included reinforced shelters used as command posts, concrete protected flak positions, hardened railway installations, and bunker complexes controlling canal crossings or road junctions. Fire requests passed through established channels and included target description, grid coordinates, and desired effects. Fire orders specified fuse type and setting. Delayed action fuses were frequently prescribed for overhead cover penetration. Where uncertainty existed regarding exact bunker location or orientation, registration rounds were fired and adjusted using observation. In built-up areas, observation frequently relied on aerial spot reports, mapped reference points, and ground reconnaissance conducted after impacts. Firing logs from heavy artillery units recorded the sequence of missions, including time of fire, charge, fuse setting, and number of rounds. Observers reported impacts as cratering, roof strikes, and penetrations when visible. In some missions, impacts were recorded by indirect indicators such as cessation of enemy fire from a specific aperture, collapse of earth cover, or dust and debris emitted from entrances. In other instances, initial rounds produced surface damage without visible collapse, followed by subsequent rounds that caused structural failure in roof sections or walls. When structures collapsed, observer comments noted blocked entrances and reduced activity at the target. German communications captured during this period included fragmented reports and messages from local commands describing bombardment effects on concrete shelters and fortified positions. Some messages referenced direct hits on overhead cover, blocked exits, and loss of internal communications. In positions where telephone lines remained functional, messages reported that personnel were moved to deeper rooms, that firing positions were unusable due to rubble, or that ventilation had failed. Where positions were isolated, reports and notes found later described conditions inside shelters following heavy impacts, including dust accumulation, difficulty breathing in confined spaces, and inability to clear debris under continued fire. American infantry and engineer units advancing into areas subjected to heavy bombardment recorded observations during clearing operations. Reports described fortifications with collapsed roof slabs, cracked walls, and blocked corridors. In some cases, the exterior of a bunker remained recognizable, but internal compartments were partially filled with concrete fragments and earth. Entrances were sometimes sealed by shifted doors, collapsed lintels, or fallen debris. Engineers used explosives, mechanical equipment, and manual labor to open access where required for inspection or clearance. Where fortifications were bypassed, perimeter security measures were recorded to prevent reoccupation. In industrial districts and rail hubs, defensive use of reinforced buildings was recorded in tactical reports. Concrete basements, air raid shelters, and utility tunnels were utilized as protected firing points, storage sites, and command locations. Heavy artillery fire against these targets required coordination with infantry movement due to proximity to friendly routes and the risk of rubble obstructing roads. Fire direction centers issued safety limits, and timing was coordinated through liaison officers. After bombardment, infantry reports described structural damage including collapsed stairwells, dropped floors, and blocked passageways. Where resistance continued, assault teams used demolition charges and engineer support to neutralize remaining positions. American service and ordnance records for heavy artillery noted continued attention to maintenance and ammunition management. Barrel inspections and recoil system checks were recorded after firing sequences. Lubrication schedules were maintained, and repairs were conducted when parts were available. Ammunition handling remained a limiting factor for sustained operations. Supply reports documented available rounds on hand, delivery schedules from depots, and expenditure per mission. Where resupply was delayed, fire missions were adjusted or reduced. These adjustments were recorded in operational logs and communicated to supported commands. German counterfire against heavy artillery positions during this period was recorded as limited in most sectors. Where it occurred, it included sporadic artillery or mortar fire and occasional small arms harassment by infiltrating personnel. Security measures around gun positions were maintained, including perimeter posts, patrols, and coordination with nearby infantry units. Camouflage and dispersion of vehicles remained routine. In some areas, air attack was not recorded as a significant factor due to conditions prevailing in the last weeks of the campaign, but concealment discipline remained in force. As American units advanced and occupied additional towns, the number of intact German fortified installations encountered varied. Some bunkers and shelters were found abandoned, with weapons removed or disabled. Others contained personnel who surrendered when approached after bombardment or encirclement. Reports described instances where small groups emerged from shelters after sustained artillery fire and infantry approach, often after internal conditions deteriorated due to blocked exits or loss of ventilation. Captured personnel were processed according to standing procedures, searched, and evacuated to collection points. Interrogation summaries recorded statements about bombardment, shelter conditions, and local unit status, with emphasis on immediate tactical information such as remaining positions, minefields, and routes. In sectors where German commands attempted to organize defense around remaining flak towers or large reinforced air defense structures, heavy artillery was considered for use when these structures were used for ground defense and when other fires were assessed as insufficient. Target descriptions referenced concrete thickness estimates and structural layouts derived from reconnaissance and technical intelligence. When heavy artillery was employed against such targets, firing was conducted under controlled conditions due to limited ammunition and the need for precision. Damage assessments were recorded through aerial photographs and, where possible, ground inspection after capture or abandonment. Reports noted cratering, spalling, and damage to external features. In some cases, the structures remained standing with visible damage. In others, parts of exterior walls or roof sections were recorded as fractured or collapsed. During the final days of active operations in May 1945, American records increasingly reflected transitions in tasks toward security, prisoner processing, and control of key facilities. However, localized engagements continued where isolated fortified positions or armed groups resisted. Heavy artillery employment in these cases depended on availability, proximity, and the operational requirement to reduce a hardened point without prolonged infantry casualties or delays. Where 240 mm howitzers were still emplaced, they could be tasked for limited missions against such objectives. Where they had already displaced or were no longer positioned for effective range, other artillery and direct fire assets were used. Unit journals and situation reports from heavy artillery battalions during this period recorded orders received, missions fired, and movements executed. Entries included dates and times, locations of firing positions, number of rounds expended, and maintenance actions. Administrative notes recorded personnel status, vehicle condition, and supply levels. Where firing ceased, records noted stand-down orders, ammunition turn-in procedures, and preparation for movement to new areas or staging points. Engineer records documented the dismantling of platforms and the restoration or marking of firing sites. Captured German documents and materials collected from abandoned fortifications and command posts continued to be processed by intelligence sections. These materials included maps, bunker diagrams, engineering notes, ammunition records, and fragments of communications logs. Technical intelligence teams compiled observations on fortification construction and the effects of heavy artillery. These compilations consisted of measured descriptions, photographs, and field sketches. Distribution was made through engineer and artillery channels for reference during ongoing operations and for immediate technical use. Across the period from late 1944 through early May 1945, the operational record for American 240 mm howitzers consisted primarily of firing data, movement orders, maintenance logs, observation reports, and supported unit after-action accounts. Within those records, the effects of heavy projectiles on German fortifications were documented through observed penetrations, structural collapse, blocked entrances, and reduced defensive fire from impacted positions. German field reports and captured notes recorded internal conditions and damage within shelters and bunkers subjected to heavy impacts. The employment of these weapons during the final phase of operations followed established artillery procedures, with target selection, fire planning, and observation conducted under the conditions and requirements present at the time.